Please welcome our next panel. Countering the global surge of anti-Semitism, IRF co-chair Katrina Lantos Swett, Deputy Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism, Keyak, and the Managing Director, Policy and Political Affairs, American Jewish Committee, Julie Rayman.
Good morning. I want to start by thanking all of you for being here and for opening up this time to talk about the issue of anti-Semitism. It's not lost on anyone in the Jewish community that we have allies that are willing to hear about the various ways that anti-Semitism manifests, especially now after the terrible attacks against Israel by Hamas on October 7th and the myriad repercussions. Anti-Semitism and international religious freedom have always had intersections, whether it's about the potential banning of circumcision or kosher slaughter, or the creation of a hostile environment that makes Jews feel like they have to hide their identities or not attend Jewish institutions, or moments like this where there are violent reverberations of hate, not just in the United States, but around the world. Dr. Lantos Swett, I want to start with you. As the daughter of Holocaust survivors, what is your reaction when people are saying, as they're saying now, that never again is now?
Well, thank you, Julie, and thank you to all of you who are here for this incredibly important conversation. You've already heard me say a few times over the last couple of days that I am very proud to be the daughter of two Holocaust survivors. And I think of myself as kind of a link in a chain that goes back thousands of years to Abraham. And when I think about that chain and think about the history of the persecution of the Jewish people, it's sort of an extraordinary sort of list of tragedies that we can think about. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Romans, pogroms, diaspora, the Inquisition. I could go on and on.
The list goes on and on, yes.
The list goes on and on, culminating, of course, in the unimaginable horror of the Holocaust. But the fact is that after the Holocaust, many of us thought, we dared to hope, dared to believe that somehow the poison had been overcome, that this most ancient, most persistent, most inexplicable of hatreds had somehow been vanquished. And I think there is no doubt about the fact that after October 7th, the ground has shifted. The mask was pulled off. We know there can be no equivocation, no contextualizing, no effort to minimize the impact of what happened. But what I want to say to this community in particular, if I may, is that you need to think about the response to anti-Semitism in the context of religious freedom as underscoring that the Jewish people, perhaps more than any other I can think of, have demonstrated what it means in the face of all those lists of tribulations that I just went through, what it means to be determined not to be forced to give up your convictions, not to be forced to break your covenant relationship with your understanding of deity. They have sort of embodied it. And in that sense, the story of the Jewish people is the ultimate story for all religious freedom advocates about what it means to be determined, to be versatile, to be unyielding in the face of all this. Now, in response to your specific question, never again is now, I also kind of want to put it in that larger context. This, in my view, is a civilizational battle. If we can kind of say that the story of the Jewish people is the story of a small, often stateless, always persecuted community determined to keep their convictions, determined to hold on to their faith, then we can also say, as many have said before me, that what happens to the Jewish people is a canary in the coal mine. And this battle against anti-Semitism truly is a civilizational battle. If we are not prepared to stand in an unyielding and ultimately triumphant way against this new manifestation of evil, we will have lost our civilization.
I think that's such an interesting framing because the reverberations around the world are being felt so acutely. AJC does an annual survey of anti-Semitism and particularly of American Jews and their perceptions. And one of the things that we discovered, because our survey was in the field right after October 7th, is that American Jews, 78% of them, feel less safe as American Jews because of what happened in Israel. So this idea that what happens in Israel doesn't just stay in Israel, I think is acutely felt. And Erin, I'd love your perspective as someone who, through the State Department Special Envoy Office, is traveling around the world and meeting with Jewish communities. What are you hearing from them?
Yeah, I mean, we live in a time right now where Jews everywhere feel less safe. And what we saw with the terrorist attacks on October 7th was horrific. And as a office headed by a Holocaust historian who's an expert in denial, what we saw on October 7th was the denial in real time of these atrocities. We saw these atrocities being live streamed, and yet too many in the world denied it. What we see in the United States and around the world is that under the guise of criticizing the Israeli government and how they're executing its war on Hamas, anti-Semites throughout the world are using that flag to engage in their anti-Semitism. And what we know is when you blame Jews or hold Jews accountable for actions of the Israeli government in Jerusalem, or, by the way, for any government, that's anti-Semitic. In front of my synagogue in downtown Washington, D.C., we have anti-Israel protests, and that's a choice. There are plenty of legitimate targets for criticizing Israel and protesting and exercising your right to protest and free speech. Of course, the Israeli embassy, my office. You can sit in front of the State Department, which happens quite often in protests, but to choose a religious institution and blame Jews for the decisions of the Israeli government, that's a choice. I mean, it would be absurd. It wouldn't even compute to go in front of a Chinese restaurant to protest the actions of the PRC because you disagree with how they're treating the Uyghurs. But yet it feels so comfortable throughout the world, including, unfortunately, here in America and specifically in Washington, to blame Jews, to attack Jews, to target Jews because of the actions of a foreign government. And we have to think about how, you were talking about how old anti-Semitism is. It's often known as the oldest hatred. And it's so comfortable, it just simmers under the surface in society. And then you see something like October 7th or any other event that gives anti-Semites the opportunity to practice their hate. In addition to the denial, what we know from these atrocities is you can't commit such atrocities as those that were committed on October 7th while maintaining the humanness of the victim, the dignity, the uniqueness of the victim, and so that
the value of human life.
And so it starts with dehumanization, right? And we know that from all of our work in fighting for international religious freedom, that the first step is not the gas chambers or the atrocities we saw on October 7th or mass imprisonment. It starts with words. It starts with looking to that human in front of you and just not seeing a human, seeing somebody, seeing another, seeing an it, seeing them, an animal.
I loved what Dr. Lantos Swett said about resilience and the ability of the Jewish people again and again and again to stand up and say, no, we're here, darn it, we're staying. But unfortunately, I feel like, yes, that is the long game. That is the overarching message. But in this moment, there are a lot of Jews who are making choices to not stand up proudly, but rather to hide, to not go to the synagogue that's being protested. I'll say in my own family, my children are of the age where they would start Hebrew school. And my husband said, let's wait a year.
Yeah.
For exactly that reason. And the AJC's survey that I mentioned before found, and we're going to release all of this data in just a few weeks, I'm just giving little snippets, 46% of Americans who are Jewish are changing their actions in some way, right? Whether it's not wearing a kippah or yarmulke, as Aaron is today, or not having a mezuzah on their doorpost, not attending a synagogue. And that, I think, is really troubling. And Dr. Lantos, Swett, I would ask you, because you really see this broad scope of international religious freedom, how do you come back from that?
Well, it's something that I have, of course, observed very close to home, actually. So my mother, Hungarian, survived the Holocaust and experienced what it meant when a country where her family had been very assimilated and, very affluent and successful, experienced what it meant when her countrymen turned against her. But it was quite interesting, and again, I'll tell a story and then try to answer the question. Some months ago, this was before October 7th, I had a beautiful mezuzah that had sort of been sitting in a drawer, and I'd been meaning to put it up. And for those of you who don't know, mezuzah is a beautiful sort of a little scroll, a scroll of scripture in a case, a metal case,
box.
in a little box that you put outside your door. And Aaron probably could explain better for me the full meaning of it.
No, that was great.
But I'd been meaning to put it up, and finally got my husband to do it, and it was made me so happy, something to touch when you come in the door. And I brought my mother to see it. She's 92 years old, 92 and a half now, but still very vibrant. And I was shocked by her initial reaction. She said, "Oh, honey, is it safe to put it outside the door?" In Hungary, we had, of course, the mezuzah, but we only had it inside our apartment, not outside where anyone could see it. And at the time I said to her, I said, Mom, you've lived in America now for how many decades? It's fine. It's fine. Of course it's okay to have it outside the door. But then another quick example. After 10/7, the first thing I did was I ordered an Israeli flag. I have a 3-part flagpole at my home. American flag is always on top, and then other flags below if we have visitors from another country, or we have the New Hampshire state flag. And I put up an Israeli flag. Well, after the invasion of Ukraine, I remember in my little community in New Hampshire, you couldn't go 2 or 3 houses without either seeing a Ukrainian flag, or somebody had wrapped their mailbox in yellow and blue, or they had a sign up, we stand with Ukraine. And it was wonderful, and we, of course, had a Ukrainian flag up as well. I've driven my whole town, and mine is the only Israeli flag.
Wow.
Which I find, of course, there are a lot of Jewish people just in my neighborhood, but I think it speaks to what you're talking about. And I think the way you come back from that, and I am certainly starting to see it, and that's what we see from community after community after community here at the Earth Summit, whether it's the Ahmadi Muslims, whether it's the Baha'is, whether it's, Christians in Nigeria or in India. You find your backbone. You find your courage. You think about those who came before. You think about sacrifices that have been made. You think about what I referred to as the unbroken chain, and you stand up. You do not hide. My mother got for every single one of the daughters in her family a beautiful bracelet, which I have not taken off, with the Star of David. And I started wearing my Mogen Davids more than I usually did. Yep. After 10/7, you show who you are. And if you're not Jewish, you're not a persecuted Christian in Nigeria, you're not a member of the Ahmadi or some other community, you find out how you can stand with them. And one of the things that this summit is about is standing up with each other.
Yeah, and I suspect part of that is because somehow standing with the Jewish community, even though they're the victims of religious persecution and the worst murder of Jews since the Holocaust, is somehow controversial, right? When it fits so easily when we're talking about Ukraine or we're talking about Boko Haram. What we saw with the atrocities on October 7th, and my boss, Ambassador Lipstadt, and our ambassador in Geneva, Ambassador Michelle Taylor, wrote an op-ed in The Guardian just recently about this subject. There were mass atrocities, and specifically with gender-based violence, and for some reason, when we say we stand with women or believe the women, somehow there's but except for when it's Jews.
Yeah.
And what we saw in the aftermath of other such gender-based mass instances of gender-based violence is understandably sports stars, government leaders throughout the world, media figures standing with those victims, as is correct. But somehow, when the victims are Jewish, there's this idea that maybe it's controversial. You know, maybe they brought it upon themselves, which in the context of gender-based violence committed against any other group would be atrocious, would be unjust. But yet, there's a pause when it comes to this particular type of victim in this religion.
That is such a good point, and I want to give a shout out to the Danes. I lived for 3 years in Denmark, and some people say this story is maybe not 100% historically accurate, but it's the counterpoint to what you're talking about. When the Nazis occupied Denmark and ordered all the Jewish Danes to begin wearing the yellow star, what some history books record, and others question whether it happened, is that the next day the King of Denmark, on his usual sort of ride through the city, wore a yellow star. Solidarity, standing with the victims, it matters. It matters. And we honor it and are grateful for it when it happens.
What I love most about that in particular is the historicity of it aside, the Danes believe it to be true.
Yes.
And they are proud of it.
Yes.
And to this day, young Danes across the spectrum will tell that story with a great deal of pride.
Yeah. And they deserve to be proud. And you know, when you stand up for your Jewish friends and neighbors, for those Jewish girls raped and brutalized, you deserve to be proud too, especially if you are not of that heritage.
So we just have a few minutes left, and it strikes me that these are dark times for a lot of us. But this conversation is leading towards a place of great hope. And so I want to ask both of you in somewhat of a different way. Aaron, you travel the world. You see communities at their depths and at their brightest moments. What communities are giving you hope right now? Is there something you've seen since October 7th that you can point to and say, yes, that's how we get to the light? And then Dr. Lantos Swett, I've heard you tell the story of your family surviving the Holocaust. And the most beautiful, poignant moment is when you talk about Raoul Wallenberg and how he saved them, and he saved so many. Who's the Raoul Wallenberg of today? Whether it's an individual or an institution or an idea. And does it exist? And you know, where's that light that we can look to today? Whoever wants to.
Well, just very quickly, one of the things that gives me a little bit of hope is when our office was created in 2004, we were the first special envoy on anti-Semitism. Now we have dozens of colleagues throughout the world within their own governments. And just really quickly, in the weeks after October 7th, we were able to rally dozens of representatives from other governments who are in this position to stand in solidarity with Israel. Maybe you should go take a look at the joint statement. Some governments might surprise you, but on this issue, when it comes to anti-Semitism, when it comes to religious persecution, when it comes to standing with the victims of such attacks, we were able to rally dozens and dozens of countries together through our colleagues throughout the world. So now we have people monitoring anti-Semitism within those governments.
Well, we are nearly out of time, and I can talk about Raoul Wallenberg at great length. He was this extraordinary Swedish humanitarian who came to Hungary at the height of the Hungarian Holocaust with one mission: to rescue Jews. My mother says they called him their Moses from the north. And I often say, and my sister Annette feels the same way, that one reason why we as daughters of Holocaust survivors didn't feel somehow quite the same burden of sadness and darkness that many other children of survivors feel is because a rescuer came into that darkness. A light shone in the darkness. And that was something that both of my parents clung to. And I do often say he didn't just help to save their lives, he saved their faith in humanity. He saved their hope. He saved their sense of optimism. And I know there are other Wallenbergs. Some of them are sitting here today. We have had, for example, as part of this summit, some amazing Muslim women who have been leading the fight against anti-Semitism, who have put their own lives at risk by speaking out, by demanding freedom for the hostages. There are so many wonderful Muslims in particular, I want to say, because that's where people want to build the conflict.
Yes.
That's where they want to create the civilizational battle. And some of the bravest people I know, and it just so happens many of them are women, are these Muslim women who are standing in solidarity with their Jewish sisters, who are speaking truth. And so I don't know that I can say a single Wallenberg, but I see lots of lights out there, and it does give me great hope.
Thank you so much. And I would add to that that for me personally, you too are among my lights. And that this morning in this conversation, being here in front of this really important group adds just a little bit of spark in a dark time and allows, I think, all of us to view the coming months and years with just a tiny bit more optimism.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Welcome back. IRF Summit Co-Chair, Ambassador Sam